Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Fellows Colloquium. Alejandro de la Fuente will be introducing our fellow speaker today. Professor de la Fuente is the Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics. He's also Professor of African American Studies and of History, the interim chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and Director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center here at Harvard. Thank you, Professor de la Fuente, for joining us.
Thank you, Krishna. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you. I wish we could be doing this in person. Hopefully soon we will be able to do that. Today I'm tasked with a rather pleasant duty, which is to introduce a dear friend, a dear colleague, a dear collaborator, and a major figure in the field of Afro-Latin American Studies, Professor Aurora Vergara, who is an Afrocolombian sociologist whose research and teaching interests include issues of intersectionality of race, gender, class, land dispossession, violence, critical race theory, comparative historical sociology, feminist approaches, and the Afro-Latin American Studies field as a whole. Professor Vergara is an associate professor of sociology at Icesi University in Cali, Colombia, and she is also the director of the Center for Afrodiasporic Studies, currently one of the few centers of its kind in all of Latin America. And she's here as the Mammolin Fellow on Afro-Latin American Studies at the Du Bois Research Institute. Aurora is the author of a very important book that I want to call to your attention, Afrodescendant Resistance to Deracination in Colombia, Massacre at Bellavista, Bojayá, Chocó, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, and which has become something of a landmark study concerning racialized violence in Colombia and in Latin America more generally. Many people think that racialized police violence is a uniquely American phenomenon. It is not. Racialized police and paramilitary violence affect many Afro-descendant communities in Latin America. In fact, the country in the Americas in which the largest number of people of African descent die at the hands of the police every year is not the US. It is, in fact, Brazil. The scholarship of Aurora deals with this tragic and urgent problem. Aurora has received numerous awards, grants, and nominations in the last decade. I will only mention a couple. In 2014, her dissertation, which later became her book, won the Martin Diskin Award from the Latin American Studies Association. This is an award for the dissertation that best integrates activism into rigorous academic knowledge production. In 2016, she was nominated as one of the 20 most influential leaders in Colombia by Semana and by Fundación Liderazgo y Democracia. Most recently, her co-edited volume, I Demand My Freedom, Black Women and Their Strategies of Resistance, received the Montserrat Ordóñez Award in the LASA Colombia section, the Latin American Studies Association Colombia section. She's currently working on a book which will become something of an anthology on Afrocolombian studies and which should represent a major contribution to that field. It is my privilege and my honor to be working with her on that volume, to be collaborating with her on that volume. And let me say something that doesn't show up in her CV, something that you will not be able to read anywhere about her. She is a formidable presence in the Afro-Latin American Studies field, and I couldn't have a better ally, a better collaborator, a better friend in our efforts to expand and consolidate this field across the Americas. So I'm going to say in Spanish, gracias y bienvenida, Aurora. Thank you and welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Alejandro, for the introduction and for your support all these years. Professor Gates, thank you. Krishna, thank you for your support and for this opportunity. It is an honor for me to be a part of this cohort of scholars. Today, I will present an excerpt of my research a chapter that was recently accepted for publication by Bristol University Press. I co-authored the chapter with Jerónimo Botero. He is a Colombian philosopher who is the Dean of the School of Law and Social Sciences at Icesi University. And the arguments of this chapter are the continuation of a series of ideas that both of us have been working on in the last years, and that I published in my 2017 book, as Alejandro just mentioned. This book was based on ethnographic research about the massacre of Bellavista. I have been working in this territory for more than a decade now. While in resident, I will work on the two projects, as you have heard before. One of these, the edited volume on Afrocolombian studies, both with Alejandro and Angelica Sanchez. We want to compile this volume to present the state of the knowledge in the field of Afrocolombian studies. We want this book to serve as a reference for future generations in connection with the literature on Afro-Latin American studies. The second goal of the book that we're working on together is to consolidate a timeline on the history of Afro-Colombian studies that enables us and enables prospective reflections on this field's future. And the third goal of the project and this particular book will be to compile empirical evidence that can be useful for the formulation of public policies and on racial justice, informed by community leaders and various actors and experiences in this field. What you will hear from me today builds on a long tradition of Afro-Colombian studies, and I hope to contribute to historical understandings, particularly of the impact of land dispossession and land grabbing. We entitled the chapter, this presentation is based on Singing Historical Reparations. And the subtitle is Alabaoras, Challenging the Spectacle of Forgiveness in Communities Affected by Deracination in Colombia. This presentation is going to have 4 moments. First, I'm going to introduce you the community of Bojayá in Chocó, so that we can discuss why this community is so important to understand what's happening regarding racialized police violence, racialized paramilitary violence. And something very interesting is that in cases in which we are asking for forgiveness and reparations and reconciliation, such as in the case in Colombia, how we can see racialized violence and racial grammar operating. The second part of the presentation is going to be on the peace agreement that Colombia signed in 2016. Then I'm going to present you a case that is very interesting, a gift that was sent to these women by former FARC members that turned into what we call forgiveness as a spectacle. And finally, the remarks at the end of what we learned from Bojayá. So why Bojayá? This is a state that is located in the northern region of Chocó. And as you can see in the point, in the pin, this community is located in a very strategic position. From this community, you can connect to the Pacific and to the Caribbean, but at the same time, you can connect to Central America and to North America. This community has over 10,000 people by now, 58% identified as Afro-Colombian, 41% as indigenous. More than 95% of the population has their basic needs unsatisfied. 61% of the population changed their residential address due to threats to their lives. More than 20% of this population changed their residential address due to the difficulty of obtaining employment. In this community, there is not a hospital. There is only one elementary school. There is not a university. There is one Catholic church. And there's 5 houses that they use for meetings of those who identified as Protestant Christians. Between 1997 and 2002, several events of violence started to occur in this territory. There was over 60 years of guerrilla presence in the region. And in 1997, there was a paramilitary incursion. Living with guerrilla and paramilitaries simultaneously established a very complicated domain because they established curfews, several regulations to control human mobility, human circulation, and also food circulation. They strengthened their control, disappearing people, threatening their lives, robbing their houses, placing landmines, and as a result, there was a massive. This resulted in massive deracination. Notice that I'm not using the concepts forced displacement, and I'm not using the concept forced migration, because as I demonstrate in the book, the concept of forced migration and forced displacement is narrow-minded, is dubious, and contributes to historical processes of land tenure. In 2002, there was inaction and complicity of the military, as has been demonstrated now. The militaries took over the community, and Bellavista and Vigía del Fuerte became the main terrain. In response to the movements of the troops of these groups, the Diocese in Quibdó, the Office of the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Ombudsman's Office began issuing early warnings to the national government that something was going to happen in this community and that they needed to act quickly. In Bellavista, a community leader started reading one document to the guerrilla members that they had prepared years ago to read to other military members, saying that they wanted their life to be respected, their mobility, and that they did not want to be involved in any armed conflict as informants, collaborators, or financiers. Finally, they asked the guerrilla and paramilitary members to withdraw from the community, but that did not happen. On May 2nd, the FARC threw 3 bomb cylinders fighting with paramilitary members who were taking refuge near the civilian population. One of the cylinders fell in the altar of the church. Between 80 and 119 people were killed that day. The final number of the casualties is still undetermined for one very singular reason. More than 55% of the casualties were children, not counting 6 of them that were in the bellies of their mothers. And if you need, there are some legal complications when to become a person, you actually had to have a birth certificate. So the Colombian government at some point did not recognize the babies as part of the casualties. So that's the reason why the researchers use the official number and the number that the community has at the record of those who are missing from their community. So this is how the charge ended up after the explosion, and the community had to take refuge somewhere else. Between May 2nd, the day of the massacre, and May 6th, terrible events occurred to the community. Those who could left the territory. Some took refuge in the houses, others ran to the jungle. Others, guided by the person that you see in the first photo, Father Antun, in the middle of the bullets, they crossed the river to a nearby community that we know as Vigía del Fuerte, which is where most of the population ended up. In the charge remain people mutilated and dismembered. Those wounded that couldn't move stayed there for 4 long days. During the day, they had sun, and at night they faced torrential rain. This person that you see here, we know her as Menelia. She is known in the community as the crazy person of the town. And she is a very important person in this whole story because she remained at the charge with the dead, carrying water to those who were wounded and still alive. She found salt and she just fed them salt and water and salt. And she was able to move the wounded to the sacristy that he still had roof to protect them. Menelia was really important because piece by piece, she started regrouping the mutilated bodies, gathering the parts that she believed belonged together. The fight between the groups lasted these 4 more days, with partial attempts to remove and to help the wounded in the charge and to bury the dead. What Menelia did is going to be extremely important for the history of this community because the remaining the parts that she grouped together were later taken to a mass grave, and it was not going to be until 18 years later that the Colombian government was going to identify the victims of this massacre. So her work was extremely important to actually take care of those who died that day. As a result of this massacre, in the community of Bellavista, Bojayá, there was a new symbol that was erected, what they know as the mutilated Christ. So take a very close look at this image, because something is going to happen that is really afterwards that is really important in this case. So this community said that this mutilated Christ that accompany those who survived for these 4 days, and now that is the symbol of the massacre, is going to be one important religious symbol. One of the reports that we collected while conducting the research says that the fragmented Christ, torn apart, is the icon of the victims, through which, despite the events, they maintain the symbolic unity. It is a reference of the personal and collective trajectory of these people before, during, and after the massacre. So the symbol, they start praying to the symbol, the mutilated Christ, and a group of women helps to create this as a very important figure for the community. And this is what we call the Alabaoras. So when you hear me saying Alabaoras, I'm referring to this group of traditional singers. They go to every funeral to accompany the family and to sing to the death. But after the massacre, something really significant occurred. Remember the previous photo that you saw with the church destroyed. They were able to convince the Colombian government that they needed the church to be rebuilt so that they could pray, so that they could help the souls of those who died to rise to heaven. But the community has not been rebuilt. So the whole town disappeared. The Colombian government created, as a form of reparation, a new town nearby this old town. However, they want this to be a historic site. Why the Alabaoras? These women did a really important job for this community. While the armed groups were impacting this community and threatening this community, they were re-inhabiting their territory, singing. They were able to defend the idea that there was an us as a community. They were able to do something really, really powerful. The Colombian government was not keeping records of those who were disappeared and killed. So they were able to insert little changes in the traditional songs just to remind themselves that in 1999, so-and-so disappeared. In 2001, so-and-so was taken to a community and he never returned. So inserting the names of the dead or the missing people in their traditional songs helped the community to keep records of what was happening. That will be really powerful years later. And they also use their songs for early alerts. As I was conducting research in this community, I realized that going to church was their safe space, as Patricia Hill Collins will say it, but it was a really powerful, revolutionary safe space because they were not threatening the armed groups, therefore they were not being killed, but they were passing around messages that helped them to protect the community, but at the same time to keep the memory of what was happening. After the massacre, they were able to organize the community, and now they are called the psychologists of the town. So they were able to go to the houses of those who had lost their families and their babies, and they were able to create traditional rituals to create new discourses about those who were displaced, those who needed help, and those who returned. They also did something really powerful, that they were able to name the babies, and through a historical connection of dialogues and stories. So they would go around the houses and ask, do you remember this woman who died in the massacre? Did she say to you what name she was going to use for the baby? And do you remember the last names? And they were able, through the songs, to bring these babies to life, or to name the babies and request the government to recognize what happened. So they were able to heal and to connect the community after the massacre. And during one moment that we are going to call the parade of vests, because the institutions will go to the community to try to rebuild the dismembered community, but at the same time, they were leaving all these empty spaces that they were able to fill with their voices and with their songs. Between 2007 and 2012, the president of the moment said that they were going to create a city in the jungle, because they were to create a new town for the survivors of the massacre. And that message was really strong because that meant destroying everything that they knew as their town. So with their songs, they were able to compose lyrics for occasions that now we know as commemorations. So they were able to mark May 2nd of every year as a day for commemoration, and they will write specific songs for that day. And from every year that passed, they were able to create a specific memory of their community. And finally, between 2012 and 2017, when we analyze their songs, what we can see is that there's one specific word that starts to appear, and is the word of forgiveness. Due to some technical difficulties, I won't be able to project the songs, but I'm going to send an email to the cohorts where you can listen to the songs on iTunes or at Spotify, and also to the webpage of the project where you can consult the songs. And here you will see the summary of the analysis that we were able to create. So the word forgiveness started to appear between 2012 and the songs of 2017. And they're going to ask the community and ask the government for conditions if they wanted forgiveness from their community. And this is going to be really interesting because after 2012, Bellavista Bojayá is going to be named the symbol of reconciliation of Colombia. And they're going to become the symbol of reconciliation in the process of the peace agreement. In my 2017 book, I proposed these two concepts, deracination and empty territories, to argue that what was happening in Bellavista was a really important case to connect it to other cases, to what Du Bois used to call the darker races of the world. When we see at the map of victims of deracination, we can see that the territories have similar histories. So I would argue that territories need to be understood, considering that they are socio-geohistorical formations that need to be understood within the context in which they are produced, lived, reproduced, and unproduced. And so are the experiences of land dispossession. Bellavista illustrates the intricate power of the intersection between people, rivers, and territories. And the people of Bojayá constantly have faced death. In the book, I introduce evidence of over 4 centuries of events of violence similar to what happened in the massacre. And this territory demonstrates that what we call empty territories or laboratories of death are contrary to spaces that are designed for enjoyment, to live a life of dignity. And the state of Chocó demonstrates that something like that happens there. So here you can see images of what used to be a really strong community that was completely destroyed, and only few houses remain standing. So this concept will help us to analyze regions such as Chocó that have been represented economically as poor, racially as Black and Indigenous, along the gender lines as virgin territories, and politically and socially as culturally backward. 16 years after the massacre, with all the work that these women did in their territory, the Colombian government decided to invite them to be the symbol of reconciliation, the symbol that we were going to pass to a complete new era. And in these two photos, you can see the president of the moment, one of FARC members, and the UN celebrating this historical moment. But the nation was not, the group of politicians that were part of the signing of the agreement did not expect that these women they were not going to offer forgiveness that day. They expected to do it, but they came with a really strong political argument that something else needed to be done to their community before they could openly say that they could forgive what had happened to them. So here we can see with just one line of one of their songs, and they say, "We want justice and we want peace that comes from the heart." That specific line led to a series of lines in their songs in which they're going to say, if we want to offer forgiveness, or you want us to offer forgiveness, we want them to take care of our community. They open a huge discussion in the country and in the middle of the signing of the agreement. And we can see that forgiveness is not disputed like memory. It is not sanctioned by law like justice. It is not decided by some bureaucratic agency, such as reparation. It is granted only by the victim. It is necessary for the peace, for political processes, such as this one. It is the contribution of the victims to the good progress of things. And there is a certain demand for the victim to forgive. And we notice with the presence of these women in the signing of the peace agreement that forgiveness became their power, but at the same time, that power became their burden. And you will wonder why that became their burden, because at the same time that they were part of the signing of the agreement in Cartagena, one part of the group was singing, and the remaining community was receiving a gift that was sent by FARC leaders to Bellavista, Bojayá. And it was a second Christ, a Christ that they would call the Black Christ of Bojayá. And you are seeing here a tweet from one of FARC leaders, that he said that day that the Black Christ of Bojayá was going to be the symbol of reconciliation of Colombia. However, that gift was not received well in the community, because remember, they already had their own Christ. So I was part of one of the meetings in which they started to debate whether or not they should receive the Christ. This Christ was sent to Bojayá along with the artist, and a Cuban artist who was commissioned to design the piece. This table is just to summarize the many instances in which this community has received offer of forgiveness and that they have not progressed. So they received in 2008 a declaration by someone named Freddy Rendon, a very young person that was the leader of one of the paramilitary groups that had been named responsible for the massacre. He did that, but the community said that they just wanted answers. They wanted to know what that happened in their community, why they killed so many people. Also, they received in 2014 a message from FARC saying that they wanted to apologize to Bojayá through Leiner Palacios, someone that is now a truth commissioner. And he argued that he could not grant forgiveness for his community, even though he had lost 37 members of his family on the day of the massacre. He said that the FARC should go to the community and ask for forgiveness. Also in September 27, in 2015, December 2015, and in September 2016, they received offers of forgiveness. And then in the year 2016, during the signing of the peace agreement, they had these 3 moments in which constantly FARC members were asking for forgiveness. Even though there is a legal obligation to the Colombian government to ask for forgiveness to the community, they have not done so to the moment. And that is a really interesting case to analyze. Why, even though the Colombian government was charged as responsible of the massacre, they have decided not to ask for forgiveness to this community. Here you're looking at pictures of survivors of the massacre of Bojayá in Cuba, while they were discussing the terms of the peace agreement, and also this piece in which they're saying that they want memory, that they will not forget what happened in the massacre, and that they want the Colombian government to report them. And here you take a look at 2 pictures. One is one of the meetings that FARC members organized in Bojayá to ask for forgiveness. And you can see how everything is closed around, so that they only had members of the community, and they asked the politicians and the media to not be part of the event, because this community was really resistant at the idea that journalists will come to the community and say that Bojayá offered forgiveness. They say, we are not ready yet. We are prepared, but we need the government to answer differently. So the Christ that you see in the second photo was the Christ that was sent to Bojayá by FARC members that really enraged this community. This is the Cuban artist in charge of the piece. His name is Enrique Angulo. I remember interviewing him in December 2016 in the community. He was perplexed because he's a really renowned artist, and he was not happy with the idea that his piece was not received well in the community. Because he's a really renowned artist, he was waiting for people to be ready to receive the gift. I don't think he was informed of how contested the territory was, and that this gift was not consulted with this community. So I had I interviewed him, and I had a really interesting conversation with him, because the community said that the Christ was an ugly. They named the Christ as an ugly piece, and they named the piece as something that they did not want. So when I talked to him about the symbol, he said something that demonstrated the racial grammar of the creation of the piece. He said that when FARC members asked to him in Havana to create a Black Christ to send to Bojayá, he said, I did not have a Black person like close to me, so I didn't have a reference. So I just asked so-and-so to go to the rural area and bring a Black person to me so I can see it. And then he said that using the Afrodescendant model was not to copy the person, but to, when he had any doubts how to recreate the Black Christ, he would just look at him and then recreate it. And then that was a really interesting conversation, because this community was really mad when they received this gift. And they had this town hall meeting, you can call it like that, to discuss if the piece needed to be returned. To take this piece to the territory, because it's huge, they had to disarm it. And that's the reason why you see in the first photo that it does not have arms. The Christ arrived to this community at the same time that the peace agreement was being signed. So one percentage of the community was in Cartagena, and the other part of the community was like facing this situation. The Christ arrived without being requested from the community, without a previous consultation, disarmed and in a bus, and by the river. So most people thought that someone had died when they arrived with the peace, in the same way in which armed groups invaded in the territories in the past. This gift was seen with perplexity, with prevention, and it was seen as a grievance. The Committee of the Victims of Bojayá called a meeting with representatives of several community councils to discuss whether or not to receive the Christ as an offer of forgiveness. And then several questions started to come. They say, isn't this gift a condensation, a substitute of the death that are in boxes that arrive at the river? Or isn't this an attempt to replace the mutilated Christ? Isn't this the gift a representation of the imposed and never agreed occupation of the territories? Is it really a disinterested offering, or does it generate the obligation to forgive? Does it replace the material and the symbolic reparation that the community has asked the government, has asked the FARC and the government for so long? I remember walking around between the community and the rivers, accompanying the leaders while they were trying to figure out what was happening. And you just imagine living for so long between different armed groups and then trying to decide whether or not to receive this gift. And what I felt most of the time is that they were really concerned if they say no, that something bad was going to happen in their communities. At the end, they decided to accept the gesture of forgiveness, but not the object. So the meeting that you see in this photo is the moment in which the artists, FARC leaders, and the Commissioner of Peace of Colombia, and the leaders of the community are installing the Christ in a nearby community, in a community that is named as La Loma, while the Colombian government, as they requested, fulfilled two basic demands. First, to properly identify the victims of the massacre that had not happened at the time, and to provide proper health care to those who survived the massacre. The concepts of empty territories and laboratories of death that I have been working with in the last decades, it built on Mbembe's argument of necropolities and Joao Vargas's and Jaime Alves's arguments of geographies of death. And you can see in this case how one territory that has been a victim of a massacre such as Bellavista and Bojayá can become the symbols of reconciliation of the country in the most important moment of history in the country. But at the same time, the racial grammar and the racialized violence is happening at a completely different level. So this community, while they were receiving the gift, they were saying, I still have pieces of the bullets. I have pieces of the explosives of the massacre in my body, and the government has not helped me with that. But now I had to receive this gift as an offer of forgiveness, but structural situations have not been changed in this context. I have also proposed the concept of empty territories, because while they are resisting and creating a space to survive, we can see these tensions happening there. So this concept is an analytical tool to analyze and to comprehend how there are territories in which you can see conquest, exploitation, violence, and deracination, fighting with politics of development, but at the same time, you can see the strong voices of these women contesting for liberation and creating narratives of existence and resistance in their territory. We still can see sections of the territory such as this. So this community continues to be the symbol of the reconciliation, but still the basic needs are unsatisfied, and still the government does not comply with the main agreements that they have signed. What do we learn from Bojayá? Through traditional songs such as Alabaoras, these songs for those who die, women at Bojayá and with them their communities, after a heinous event of violence such as the massacre, they sing and reinvent their territory. They re-inhabit their territory with their songs to reappropriate it symbolically. So they do not let these marks of violence to be the the main footprints of the territory. Through their songs, they re-inhabit it and create new symbols of life. These alabaos become a strategy to defend their sense of community, and also a strategy to regroup their community. Asking forgiveness balances the relationships of power between the community, the Colombian government, and the armed group, as you can see it, because it's like something is not closed until this community formally says that they have forgiven the government, that they have forgiven all these groups. So that's why we are arguing that there is, in that particular instance, there is a power dynamic that they have as a resource to negotiate. And they were able to create this resource with their songs. This newly gained power allows these communities to take initiative on the agenda and in the peace process, because now they are invited to every important event in Colombia regarding peace processes, the visit of the code, or any important political space in which they can voice their demands. Since they're actors of the process, of the peace process, need forgiveness to move on, and they cannot force forgiveness out or ruled by law, forgiveness becomes a good bargaining strategy and a good bargaining resource for these aggregated communities. So 2 years after the signing of the agreement, they were able to get the Colombian government to properly identify the victims that were in the mass grave. But that happened, imagine the massacre was in 2002 and the identification of the victims was in 2018. So for all this time, they were mourning to a mass grave, and most of the families said, I just want to know where my child is. I just want to know where my husband is. Or those who lost more than 30 people, I just want to know where they are. I just want to light a candle. I just want to bring flowers to the actual person that I know, that I loved. In this case, we learned that forgiveness is a process more than an act. In this case, we learned that singing historical reparations is a political act that is aimed to restore the broken dignity of these communities. And I thank you for that.
Thank you. That was very moving. Can I ask? I'm trying to figure out about the Black Christ from Cuba. What I missed. Where is it now? What happened to it?
Yeah, so the Black Christ from the Cuban artist is now in a nearby community. So it is still in the municipality of Bojayá, but it's not in in Bellavista, Bojayá, where the massacre occurred. So they were able to say, we do not receive this object until after the government complies with our requests.
I see. So it became a bargaining chip.
Exactly.
I bet it blew the poor Cuban artist's mind. He does this grand gesture to Black people, and he goes, what? They don't want your Christ.
Yeah, he was. I remember him saying, I don't understand. This has never happened to me in my life. When I arrive with something, like there are thousands of people waiting for me, and I come to this community and nobody's waiting for me, and they do not want to receive it. He was really struck by that.
So let's open it up, Krishna. Will you curate questions, comments? This is fascinating. You know, still, I have to say, Aurora, a lot of Americans don't even know Black people are in Colombia. As much as hyperbolic as that sounds, it's still true that the Black presence in Colombia is an understood, undervalued, underappreciated presence in the New World. Even in my series, we couldn't do we couldn't do everything, right? So we did Brazil, and then we have supplemental funds, as I mentioned to you, once COVID's over, to go back and do Colombia on its own, which will be very exciting. And I hope you'll be a consultant and help us with that series, because it's a very important, complicated story to tell. Questions, comments, please.
Alejandro has a question that he's put into the chat. He asks, how did FARC choose Angulo?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Gates, for your comments and questions. And I will definitely be a consultant when the moment arrives. And I see here some scholars from Center for Afrodiasporic from CEAF at Icesi. So we are your family in Colombia. Anytime you want to come, we will be able to help with the project.
Thank you. Bless you. I'll be there. Choco, here I come.
Yeah. Thank you. And regarding Alejandro's question, this is a really interesting question. When they were discussing the terms of the agreement in Cuba, the artist told me that FARC members contacted him because he had done in the past Manuelita and Bolivar for them. So they already had a relationship with them, with him. So they commissioned this piece based on what he had done in the past. So they told him, or that's what he told me in the interview, and he told us in the interview, because it was a lot of us in the interview, that they said, we did a terrible thing in Bojayá, and we would like to offer something as a gift, or something that can represent forgiveness. So would you be able to do something similar to what you did with Manuelita and Bolivar, a similar structure, but something that can say that we want forgiveness? And they say probably it could be a religious image, because they are a very religious community. And then in the discussion, they came up with the idea that's probably a Christ could be a good offering. And then he said that he asked if they wanted the regular Christ or something that was more cohesive for the territory, or someone that will help this community to see themselves in this new Christ. And that's when they came with the idea that they could create a Black Christ. But I don't think they were expecting the response from this community when they saw the representation of the Christ. So that's how they selected Angulo as the artist. It was during the agreements that they were having in Havana. And then I remember that they included a few politicians from Colombia to help him get the actual piece to Colombia. Yeah, Alejandro is right. He has never worked on Blackness, and the interview is really interesting, because he was saying, like, I had the idea. They said something religious, probably a Christ. This is a very religious community. Most of them are Black. So he has like these pieces of information, and he started putting it together. And then in the interview, he said that he was like trying to recreate how a Black Christ would look like. So he said, the hair, I use the hair because something similar to what I see in the Caribbean. So the hair of the Black people grew like that, or grows like that. So he just decided to go for the locks. And then the mark that Christ has on this side, he used a machete to represent the opening. And he said that the symbol of the machete in the rib, it was to be coherent with the peasant practices of the community, but none of that worked. So that's a good comment that Alejandro is doing that, because you can see in the piece that he has not worked on Blackness, and that the representation of the Christ was a really complicated gift for this community. Thank you, Alejandro, for the questions and comments.
Jim?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I'm not using my usual computer, so it's, that was a great presentation, Aurora. That's a really fantastic, I mean, it's a really fascinating project. I'm still trying to work my way through it. I mean, the idea of triple representation was a pretty interesting idea to me, among other things. I had a couple questions, though, about things that I didn't quite understand, or was hoping you could give me a little more clarification. And I'll just ask them and then you can answer them in turn. The first one is, so about these traditional songs where they're inserting the names, I was just curious, is this a kind of thing that had been done in the past, or are they doing something completely new with these traditional songs? I couldn't tell, what was, that was interesting to me. The other question I have is, what do you mean by deracination? Maybe I missed it, but the way you use it is a little different than the way I'm used to it. So it seemed like an important concept, but I wasn't sure I was really getting it. Thank you again for the great presentation.
Thank you, Jim, for the questions and also for the comments. I really appreciate them. Yeah, they have done this in the past. They have changed older traditional songs in the past to just make sure that someone appreciates that their name is in a song. So what I noticed while I was conducting research in 2004, 06, and 07 is that they have older songs, not only the Alabaoras. They have decimas, which they use to celebrate. So these are not songs to mourn, these are songs to celebrate. So in las décimas, what they do is that they insert the name, for example, to sing a song at a birthday party, or they insert the name if they want to welcome people to the community. So if scholars from Icesi go to the community, they will use decimas to say, so-and-so, welcome to our community. So there is a tradition in this community to use songs, traditional songs, to communicate. The power of Alabaoras, and that's the reason why the Alabaoras were the ones selected as the political discourse and not the other songs, is that they were present at very important moments. So they were present to commemorate and the fact that they were part of commemorations made it symbolic, because you will see presidents coming to the mass, and then when they hear to the Alabaoras, they will feel questioned by the community. And this community is starting to realize that they could question presidents, that they could question politicians, that they could question military and paramilitary members. And since it was a song, they had no arms in their arms. They realized that they could sing and they could say very strong arguments without being labeled as dangerous. So this Alabaoras started to change completely. And in the message that I'm going to send you, you will see the songs and you will listen to the songs. And also you can read to the lyrics, most of them are in Spanish. So we're still working on the English translation of the songs. But for those who can follow in Spanish, you can notice that they are mostly singing to saints in the traditional songs. In the new songs, they change completely the lyrics. They only preserved, I don't know how to say that, they only preserved the sound. And then they inserted a complete new lyric saying, for example, President Santos, we need you to pay attention to the peace agreement. We are tired of being lied to. We are waiting to receive this and this. They completely changed the lyric. So they have this tradition in the community, but only Alabaoras became such a symbolic figure or such a symbolic means of communication. And regarding deracination, the concept of deracination and using the concept to mean uprooting and to argue that the field of the sociology of forced migration, while using the concept of forced migration, is not allowing the field to recognize historical land tenure, historical experiences of land dispossession, and that the concept of deracination allows to understand cases such as Bojayá. So in the book, I have one graph in which I demonstrate that the same piece of land that you saw where the massacre occurred, there were other events of violence that I found in the archives. So in 1810, the communities were burned down, the same communities in the same piece of land during the wars of independence. I also found evidence all the way to the 16th century. In 1556, I found evidence of the indigenous communities, the Kunas, who used to live in the same piece of land because it's really strategic to move in around the continent. They were deracinated as well. So when you see the concept of forced migration, or you see the concept of forced displacement, what it allows sociologically, it allows you to account for the movement of people. The definition of the literature of forced migration says that you can be a forced migrant or you can be a forced displaced due to development projects. You can be an asylum seeker or a refugee due to conflict-induced displacement or conflict-induced or development-induced displacement or disaster-induced displacement. They also will argue that you can be an internally displaced person due to environmental disasters, for example. Or also you can be an internally displaced person if you have been smuggled or trafficked. However, when you notice the components of the definitions, the concept that does not allow for the long-term processes of violence. It does not, sociologically, it does not help you to create a framework to introduce long historical processes of violence. So you can notice for the components of the definitions that you can account for the coercive and otherwise involuntary character of the movement. You can account for the case of internal displacement or the fact that such movement take place within national borders, or sometimes with the framework of forced displacement and forced migration, you can account for the immediate and sometimes assumed the force that is inducing the displacement of the movement. But this framework does not allow to identify that when these people move, everything changes. So you notice the landscape and how their life is organized around a huge and vast territory. Their life is organized around the movement of the river. Their lives are organized around the seasons in which they grow certain fruits and vegetables. When they are taken away from their territory, where they are uprooted, everything changes completely. Everything is destroyed. And the concept of forced migration and forced displacement does not help us sociology to describe such a profound phenomenon. So the concept of deracination allows us to take into consideration such complications. It allows us to consider that these communities have been for a very long time part of these territories, but at the same time that they have been victims of these events of violence in different moments. And also that sometimes they are victims of several forms of deracination at the same time. In the book, I proposed a theoretical framework that I call DTD square, to say that if we take destierro into consideration, or deracination into consideration, we can see, for example, how Bellavista, every community that came to Bellavista, except for the Cunas, were victims of diaspora process, where they came through the diaspora process. So most of the Afro-descendants that came to this piece of land came after in emancipation. So there we have one moment of diaspora that you need to take into account. They were able to create this as their territory. So they were able to territorialize the territory. So that's what the T stands for. And then they are forced to new instances of deracination. And that's the reason why I say that we need to add a D square, because the deracination process opened a new instance of diaspora, and then the process starts over again. So that's the reason why I'm arguing that we need to move beyond the sociology of forced migration, because the field does not recognize these cases that had, in which Afro-descendants, for example, have been victims of violence for so many years. But at the same time, they find ways to survive in these contexts, but the governments do not supply what they need to continue living. So we have these people living in spaces that are constantly laboratories of this. And that's the reason why the concept of empty territories is useful also to think how the government and the politicians and many armed groups relate to these communities. I hope, Jim, that answers your questions. I don't know if that was too intricate or if it clarifies a little bit.
Thank you. I think you clarified a lot. Rita?
Thank you, Aurora. I'm just gobsmacked. My first question is, why doesn't the world know about this? It's not generally known as far as I can tell. And I have to say, the very factual, matter-of-fact way you presented this made it all the more horrible for me. And I felt like I wanted to cry. But I was struck by a number of things. One is the fact that it was women, yet once again, who organized the movement toward, I guess, I want to say reconciliation, or toward some kind of healing and forgiveness. The fact that the idea of keeping people alive by saying their names is another continuity through time and cultures. And also the power that this image had, that this was like this Christ that was created was almost like a toy back and forth in a funny way. But what I guess my question was, or is, to me, especially in South America, an image of Christ almost by virtue of being created as Christ, almost acquires a wholly other aspect. And from the story you told, the religiousness, the sacredness of this image was almost absent. And I found that both interesting and I was curious about it at the same time. So it's as if the power of the concept of reconciliation superseded the holiness or the numinous of the sculpture. And I wonder, and also I did find it particularly curious that a white artist was chosen. That's neither here nor there, but he did not use a Black person as his model, as if he couldn't find any. And do you think that would be different today? So sorry.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Rita, for your questions and for the reflections on this presentation. Why doesn't the world know about this? That's a really powerful question. I think we need to continue presenting and letting the world know about what happened in Bellavista, because they still need reparation. This is a horrible case, and the victims are demanding the government and many institutions to support. Even though they have hard support from the United States, from many international institutions and countries, I think the case needs to be widely known. Probably we can find ways to teach a bit about this case, to create audiovisual pieces that can help people to get to know what happened there. Because what we see is that this is going to continue happening. I think you must have seen the images of the Haitian citizens that were trying to get to the United States, that were being treated in a very violent way at the border. Most of them traveled through that piece of land to get to the US. So it is important to connect what's happening in the United States to these cases, because as we have noticed in this region, these cases of violence are a constant. And that's why the concept of deracination is so important, because this keeps happening depending on the development project that is in place. So this is necessary. It's necessary that for the world to know about this case, and I will continue working on presentations and strategies to get their stories known. And I'm not so sure if this will be different today with everything that we know, because when we talk about racial grammar or racialized processes, what we see, first of all, is the denial. And in Colombia, we have this national debates about what is racism and what is not. And the first thing that comes to mind is, or the first answer that we receive is, no, that is not racism. No, that is not racialized. No, that is not violence. You are just being too sensitive. So we still need to continue working on this debate, because as you can see, the object is in the territory. The fact that when the community said no, this group of people and this group of leaders did not have the respect to say, you know what, we made a mistake. We are going to move this to another location. They, in fact, kept the peace there. And if you take a close look at how they are singing, how they are there singing, receiving the object, you can notice that a lot is going on, that they are not happy there, that they are not receiving this with pleasure, that they are not receiving this, and that many things need to be addressed to continue the life in a territory that is so impacted by violence. So I don't think it will be different today, because the object is still there. And I have not thought about this until now that you asked me, because now I'm questioning myself, say, why is the object still there? Why did not these leaders decide this community is not happy with this? We are going to remove the object, and we are going to find new ways to ask for forgiveness, and to way that we receive this forgiveness from you. So there are several things happening here, and that's the reason why understanding this as an instant of racialized forgiveness, understanding this as an instance of racial grammar, help us to understand why this happened, why this keeps happening in this community. Why are these victims not the protagonists of their story, but on the contrary, they had to live with an object that they do not want to see. If you go to a community, you see the kids terrified at the image. They just walk around, say the dead thing, the dead thing. They talk to they refer to the object as the dead thing, because they saw it come to their community in a box, as they see all the people that died in the community arrive to the community. And it was so huge, it's close to 2 meters long, or a little bit more. So it is like a person. So they refer to that as the dead thing, as the object that is terrifying, as the object that is just there in the charge, but that they do not consider a sacred object. So reading it as a racialized object as an instance of racialized violence has helped us to question the reasons why the object's still there, but also to question why it is not seen as problematic by most of the actors involved in the peace process. I don't know, Rita, if that answers your questions. If not, we can discuss a little bit more, but we're getting coffee.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you. Let me join the chorus of people singing your praises for acting as a conduit for this important story to bring it to broader publics. I wanted to ask about singing. If Jim kind of asked about how songs, these particular songs, articulate with other kinds of songs, I'm interested in how the singing that you study here articulates with other forms of or other mechanisms for witnessing and memorialization. It's quite clear that this functions in a particular way as a sort of weapon of the weak in terms of sort of political protest or sort of political pushback. But I was curious about the sort of process of memorialization and the way that this Black crisis, like this effort to memorialize or kind of brush things over as well. And so I'm wondering about how the songs themselves operate within a milieu of other forms of commemoration and memorialization within the community itself. I was wondering if you could share something about that. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for the question, and also thank you for the connections that you are making, because it definitely is a part of a much broader series of strategies of resistance and organization in this community. I was able, and we were able to highlight the songs because the other strategies have been studied more in the literature. So you can see, for example, the ways in which they, I forgot the word, tejer in English, and the ways in which they create pieces of clothing with the names of the members of the community is one strategy. Also, they were able to memorialize their stories by writing in their diaries of resistance, but also they were able to create other instances of memory of the process through what happens in the local church. The local church is a very interesting locale to analyze, to create a memory in a very contexted terrain, because they found that as a safe space. They were able to come to the mass and write, and then also to strategize. So definitely the songs are part of the strategies of resistance, and they also were able to create strong alliances with universities, and they were able also to create strong alliances with some members of the government that were able to write really strong reports about what happened in the community. So what we decided was to emphasize on the songs, because it was not being studied in the literature. So this is one of the first research projects in which you can see analyzing the songs. And sociologically, what I'm proposing here is that most of the time we disregard the knowledge that is produced in the community, because in sociology, most of the time, it's the scholar that goes to the community, collects the information, and the ethnographic notes create a powerful narrative of what's happening in this space. Or we base our analysis in documentary evidence and also statistical evidence. So I realized that was an accident, actually, when I realized that that the songs were a really powerful piece of research, because I was detained by one military member because I was taking photos in the community, and behind me was a young man with a necklace that had a bullet. So the military member said that I was doing something with this young man, and that was suspicious. So I was taken, and I was so afraid about what happened that I went to the women in the community and I said, I am so scared. I don't want to go out to continue this project. And then they brought me to their kitchen and said, you have lived nothing about what we have lived in this community. If you want to do research here, you gotta be a little bit stronger. So they brought me to the kitchen, we cooked a lot, and then I was so afraid that I just said, I just want a moment for myself, let me just look around. And then they gave me their notes for the mass, and I started preparing for them. And then I realized that the songs were so powerful. Some of the songs says, this is the song to fight oppression. This is the song to fight the violence that they impose upon us because we are Black. And then I said, like, this is it. This is a whole new level of understanding on how to resist in such a polarized context, but in a context in which you are constantly threatened, disappear, or killed. So that's the reason why the songs were selected to be analyzed in this research project. And in the literature already helped us to understand the importance of other strategies, as I mentioned previously. And now, only after 2017 is that we are talking about the songs as these powerful images and these powerful mechanisms of memorialization and these powerful mechanisms of survival. And by doing so, what we are doing is that we are placing the women of the community as the creators of knowledge and the protagonists of the creation of knowledge in this process.
Thank you. And Dwight?
Thank you, Aurora, for that very fine presentation. And it's fascinating to me. So many questions I have, but let me just give 3 short comments and then ask my question, because I see so many correspondences with what you're describing and discussing with the ways in which there are kind of North American, African American experiences. So for example, you know, there's a trope in Black funerals where we say, as long as you say their names, they are not dead. And so the idea of invoking names always keeps their presence alive. And to that, the whole idea of replacing a new lyric over an existing melody, of course, is endemic to African-American vernacular and folk culture, right? So we might sing the spiritual with one set of texts, but the same melody is used with a whole new set of texts. And so it might be something that's just in our African DNA, where we, you know, keep recreating the story, but we use the melodies that we think are important. And so the idea that saying their names, putting in the names of those who we mourn to keep them alive, inserting that to me seems significant. The idea of overlaying lyrics, and remember the whole civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s was repurposing old melodies with new lyrics. So there seems to be a theme that runs through perhaps our African diaspora culture. And then this whole idea of jockeying and bartering around an African, around the Christ figure and offering it as a sacrifice that the people might accept, which of course they didn't, to me is almost biblical, because, you know, there's a passage in Isaiah where the narrative is, I don't want your sacrifices, I want your love. I don't want, you know, a symbol. I want something significant. And as people were rejecting this mapped on African Christ, it seems that once again resonates. So here's my question in all those little comments. What's most fascinating is the politicization of this idea of forgiveness, that a government or a group would seek forgiveness through these various mechanisms from the people who have been harmed. And the reason why I raise that as an issue, it is in some ways kind of antithetical to the ways in which I think about forgiveness. Forgiveness can't be bartered, at least in my rather narrow theological frame. It's freely given. That's why it's forgiveness. So the ways in which you're talking about it, I find really interesting, and I hope we can talk about it. My question is simply this: do you see correspondences between what you're describing in Colombia with any part of the African-American journey, politically, spiritually, or otherwise?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And thank you for your answer. While you were presenting last week, I was thinking about the correspondences. And sometimes we equate Alabaoras to blues.
Mhm.
And I would love for you to hear the volume of Voices of Resistance
Mhm.
to see if you find any connections, because we found them. We find the connections between blues and Alabaoras, and we find the correspondences there. So I think when I read the Angela Davis's book about the blues and feminism,
Mhm.
that book helped me a lot to understand what we're trying to do with the Alabaoras, because these women are giving us strong ideas to find alternative ways to narrate our presence. And I'm always thinking about, there's one generation of women in Bojayá, the generation of that now they should have 18 years now. These babies were born the year of the massacre, and they grew with the stories of the massacre. And at CEAF, we were able to produce a documentary that included their stories. And for us, it was very powerful to see the mothers of these young teenagers laughing, because in previous projects that we did with them, they would not laugh at all, because the stories that they would tell us were the stories of, I crossed the river, I came out of the charge, escaping the massacre, and I crossed the river with my child in my belly. They will say the story all the time. And this person knows about the massacre because we sing about that in the church. We tell them about that in the church, but they did not live it. But they tell it like they lived that, if I actually were there. But when you try to connect, they were there. They do not remember when they were there, except for those who at the moment had like 5 or 6 years. That sometimes that's a really sad story, but I have to tell it for you to understand where I find the correspondences. Some mothers with children around 5 or 6 during the massacre, they took the kids out of the church and they will place them here to be able to cross the river. So the children saw the faces of their mothers while the mothers were trying to escape. So and their fathers. So imagine this is a really long river. They are trying to escape for their lives. So the children, 5 years later or 10 years later, they will have these really strong psychiatric reactions, telling their mothers and fathers, you tried to kill me, you were trying to kill me. And they say, no, I was not trying to kill you. I was just trying to save you. Because in their faces, what they remember is that sometimes their mothers and fathers were trying to drown them. Because when the bullets were coming to them, they will have to hide in the water and then come back out. So imagine the children looking at this person that is drowning them, and the memory is that you tried to kill me. So during these intervention projects that we work with them, it was really interesting to see this new generation trying to heal with all this trauma, and different instances of the projects that we have developed with them. And now they sing these songs as if they survived the massacre, now that they healed from all this. And when you listen to the songs and you listen to the blues in the United States, it is amazing, the correspondences. You can see these women singing in their kitchens. You can see these women singing when they are working in the river. You can see them singing while they are going to their farms. And you can find really powerful and really strong correspondences there. So I definitely think that the correspondences are there, and that definitely you have some important point when you see that we have a long tradition of inserting new lyrics and in existing melodies, just as a way to survival. So thank you for that, and let's continue talking about those. Definitely, I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Fine presentation.
Wendell?
Yes, Aurora, thank you so much, yes, for this wonderful presentation, and also the care and detail that you are exhibiting while answering all these questions and having this discussion. So I've been thinking a lot, just since the end of the presentation, just about it's just sort of the difference between interpersonal relationships and then relationships between individuals and larger groups or entities, whether it be companies or governments, and the way that governments in this case are able to sort of commit atrocious acts sort of based on dehumanizing the people that they're committing these acts towards. And but I was just thinking that it's sort of that dehumanization occurs at all different parts of the process, right? So even in terms of asking for forgiveness, this idea of going to someone else and asking them to make something that you will then deliver as if it were your own in order to ask for forgiveness for something that you did. And I was just thinking about it on an interpersonal level. If I had, seriously wronged somebody, the idea that I would then go ask somebody to make something that they would then, take the time and care to make, to then give me, to then present in an incredibly haphazard way for my sins, just seems almost bizarre. And I guess the question that I have is, do you know, and forgive me if you mentioned this, but what was the commission for the artist? I mean, I'm assuming that the artist was paid, right? So that even takes it a step further, right? It's like you're now paying someone else who has nothing to do with anything that happened, but who also isn't capable of creating something through no fault of their own, necessarily or inherently, something that's representative of the people that you're asking forgiveness from. It just seems like just a bizarre set of circumstances in order to ask for forgiveness. I'm just wondering, what do you know if there was a commission paid, and what that was, or how the artist felt about that, if there was?
Yeah, thank you for that question and for the reflections as well. Yeah, I don't know, and I was wondering the same, because when I was rehearsing yesterday with Tom, I was looking at the images, and then I realized, Alejandro and Professor Gates, they must know the artist. And I said, I need to warn Alejandro that I'm going to mention this tomorrow, because probably he knows this person. And then he said, yeah, small world, I do know him. And then all these questions that I didn't have in the past started to emerge now, like how much they paid for this, because they did ask. The women in Bojayá, they did ask. And one of my field notes is about the meeting. There was one woman, she's really tall and really strong. She's one of the survivors of the massacre. And when you are close to her, you can see in her body the remaining, the part that she's missing from the massacre. And then there are some parts of her body in which she has metal parts under her skin. And when they presented the body, when they presented the gift, she said, I want to know how much you paid for this. I want to know how much you invested. Sending that from Cuba to Bogota, from Bogota to Medellin, from Medellin here. How many people were involved in this? And the government has not invested a single penny in my recovery. How do you want me to forgive? She said, I'm quoting her. How do you want me to forgive if every night, she says that every time it rains, the metallic parts move. She said, how do you want me to forgive if every time it rains in a rainy region, this moves inside? I remember every day while I was in the charge, bearing all this pain. And now you want me to receive this object as an offer of forgiveness? And she went on and on about how disrespectful it was for her. But while listening to her and the other women in the meeting, I felt the pain, but at the same time, I felt the pain, but at the same time, I felt the fear that what they were saying was really dangerous for them, because they didn't know what was going to happen. At the point that they said, I don't care about the consequences. Just tell them that I don't want this here. I just want the government to take me to the hospital to get all these things removed, I want my family to be recognized. I want a mausoleum. I want a proper cemetery for my family, and I want to be repaired. And they created this beautiful concept that I mentioned in the chapter along with Jerónimo. They created the concept of the reparation of the soul. So while they were negotiating with the government, they say, we want you to know that what you did to us, to repair what you did to us, you need to repair our souls. So since you cannot do that, you need to work really hard to get to what we want. So you still are not close to the reparation that we want from the government. So I still don't know how much they pay to the artists. I wish I know. I want to know. I'm going to continue this research, so eventually we will get to know. Probably I will know if they don't want to reveal that information, but that would be really important to see the investment on the object and everything that was involved in the process of offering this object and this piece, this offering of forgiveness that ended up as you heard today. Thank you for the question.
Why don't you interview the artist? I mean, you could call him on his cell phone.
Yeah, I interviewed him in the past, but now with the questions that are coming after this presentation, I would love to go back to interview him now outside Bojayá, because I remember that he was traumatized. When I interviewed him, he was traumatized. He was like, yeah. What is this? What is this that I'm living?
Yeah, you should do a Zoom. I mean, you know, that works today in Cuba.
Yeah.
And you should interview him. It would be very interesting to get the other side, because I'm sure he's a very compassionate person. He felt like he opened the door and a bucket of water fell on him. You know? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll definitely do a follow-up.
Aurora, I have to go. We're in San Francisco. We're heading to the airport to go to Los Angeles. I don't know if you all know, but 2 nights ago, there was a report that Wally Soyinka had died. I mean, I woke up at 4 a.m., frankly, to go to the bathroom, and my phone was all lit up. I couldn't figure it out. And it said, Paul Gilroy had written me, Farrah Griffin, saying they were so sorry that Soyinka had died. And I spent, Dwight, from 4 to 6 a.m., because I didn't want to wake up Mariel, just in agony, because you all know he's my friend. And I just couldn't believe it, because we were together in New York Tuesday a week ago. And then at 6 a.m., I got out of bed, and I mean, it was horrible. And I Googled, and there was no New York Times. And then I got an email that it was fake news. Somebody had hacked into the account and just made this up. And he happens to be in LA. So we are leaving to go down to celebrate his resurrection at dinner tonight over a lot of wine. He was lost and now found.
Enjoy.
And it was so terrible. I was writing his eulogy in my head, you know, and I thought, Dwight, his family is in Nigeria. I thought we were going to have to go down, identify the body, you know, arrange to have it shipped to Nigeria. It was 2 hours of hell. So I'm very happy, because my friend, born again. So I'll see you.
Oh my God.
You guys hang in there. Aurora, this is fabulous. And keep me posted about the artist. I can't wait. I want to tape it. I want to see that thing. Anyway, bye-bye. Brilliant job. I'll see you guys next week. Wish me luck. I'll be thinking about you when Soyinka and I are killing all that wine tonight.
Give him
bye-bye.
Enjoy.
Okay.
I will.
Libya Diaz.
Yes, thank you. Greetings, everyone from Colombia. And thanks, Professor Aurora, for these deep and important reflections to the Afrodiasporic Studies in Colombia. I want to ask you, what do you think is needed to avoid that events of violence in communities affected by the Deracination become spectacles? And the reason why I'm asking this question after 19 years of the massacre of Bojayá, it's because the laboratories of deaths in Colombia continue working. 6 days ago, for example, 4 children were bombed in Chocó, and the some words of the government were that the bombing was legitimate, in spite of there were 4 children who died in this bombing. So I would like to know, what do you think is needed to avoid this? Thank you.
Thank you, Livia, for the question. And I want to call colleagues of the cohort your attention that Professor Jose Dalisa was showing you the piece of how the Voices of Resistance volume, the album that I'm going to email you, how it looks as an object. So there you have the CD with the songs and with the lyrics or the songs that the women produce. So we were able to work with them to keep records of their songs, because they did not have actual records of what they have written in the past. So we were able to create this CD and volume with all the information for research and for the community to have a memory of the process. So that was what he was showing you there. I will email you the digital version so that you can have access to it. And also I want to call to your attention that Livia Diaz, the person that just asked the question, she's a tremendous leader in Colombia. She is the representative of, the legal representative of something that we call ancestral communities and community councils. And she's a brave leader in one of the most contested terrains of collective lands in Cali, in Colombia. And she has been able to get her land to have a proper title, to be respected by the community, and to be recognized as a community council. So I see that the question is coming from this process of trying to have her land defended, her land protected, and properly recognized. But at the same time, because what I presented today about Bojayá continues to be a constant problem in Colombia for Afro-descendants. Just only 100 days, the first 100 days of 2021, we saw more than 44 Black teenagers killed in Colombia. So this is a problem that we need to connect to the United States, because we can see how anti-Blackness is manifesting across the African diaspora. So how to avoid this, Livia? That's a question that I think we need to all work on that, because this is a constant threat around the globe. We are seeing so many Afro-descendants, so many Black young teenagers being threatened and being killed systematically. So when you said how to avoid this to become a spectacle, I think this is a challenge that we have as humanity, because after what happened to the videotaping of the killing of George Floyd, we see that this keeps happening and happening, and that constantly the destruction of Black lives continues to be presented as a spectacle, and most of the perpetrators do not think to regret what they are doing. So I think that we need to continue our actions of defenders of the collective lands and ancestral territories, but also we need to continue discussing what is it about anti-Blackness that keeps getting stronger and stronger. What is it that the lives and the bodies of these young men continue to be the center of such and strong violence? Why this continues to be the case? I don't know how to avoid it, but I know that we have the networks, that we have the research, that we have the connections to making the case that these narratives need to be addressed, that the narratives of necropolitics, that these narratives of making the bodies of Afro-descendants the main objects of killings need to be addressed and need to be discussed. We need to continue analyzing what are the global impacts of this anti-Blackness, because it's happening in Nigeria, it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Colombia, it's happening in South Africa, in Brazil, in New York, in Mexico. So what's happening around the world that anti-Blackness is becoming this global trend, eliminating the lives of Black men and Black women across the globe. So I hope that your thesis help us also to discuss these subjects, because I know that the thesis that you're writing is going to help us to understand how this happens in a contemporary community council. I know that what you are writing is going to help us to address this as a spectacle. And the last idea that comes to my mind when you ask me how to avoid this spectacle is to name that this is happening. This is important. To name that this is occurring in these territories can help us to visibilize the racial components of these practices. What you hear today took us a long time to identify the racial components of what was happening with the relations that the military members and politicians had with this community, and to name it as racialized forgiveness, I think is helping us to understand something that we did not understand in the past. So one step also we could think about avoiding this could help us to name this as a spectacle. In Colombia, we can have this conversation, and I think we need to know this conversation because just this morning, a friend of ours, also a great leader, was asking for help because she was in a crossfire. So we need to continue working on this. Livia, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, thanks. The most extraordinary talk, but I thought one of the more extraordinary parts about it is the courage that it takes to actually do this sort of research. I know in Colombia that there's a history of this sort of research in sociology and participant action research, but still, that it continues, I find amazing. My question is, can you place Bojayá in the context of other massacres in Colombia? What is perhaps distinctive to it? And I suppose sort of continuing the question of Libya. Yeah, I mean, this is a phenomenon that is global, but what about the variation within Colombia?
Thank you, Michael, for the question. This is a really important question. And yes, I can place it in other contexts, the context of other massacres in Colombia, because Bojayá was named one of the most emblematic massacres in Colombia, and Colombia has had several massacres. And we see that we connect this to the massacre, for example, in Naya, one in the Cauca region. If we connect it also to a massacre that occurred in Trujillo, we can see the something that we call a spectacular brutality in the field of anti-Blackness. We call that through these forms of these strategies of killing people, you can see how this spectacular brutality occurs or happens. So placing Bojayá in connection with these other massacres, you can see something really painful occurring, and is the disregard for the lives of Black people. Because while reading the legal documents, the legal proceedings, survivors of the massacre were able to testify that they saw how members of the Colombian military groups took from the community paramilitary members while leaving behind Afro-descendant members of the community that they noticed that they were dying. So they prioritized members of paramilitary groups, and they left behind members of the community dying. And that is a really interesting case in relation to other massacres in Colombia, because the accounts of the survivors were really important for the court to rule that the Colombian government was responsible at the same time that the paramilitaries and the militaries and the guerrillas, excuse me. So Bojayá is one of the few cases that we have in Colombia in which you have a tripartita responsibility. You have the court saying the government is responsible, the paramilitary groups and the guerrilla members are responsible for what happened in this community. So while placing it in the context of all these massacres, you can see that particular contribution that understanding this case brings, but also the long historical connections to previous events of violence also makes the case of Bojayá interesting, because what I mentioned, one town that is across from Bellavista that we know as Vigía del Fuerte. And that town is really important because you can find connections between the contemporary era and the colonial era. And why? Because the town was named Vigía del Fuerte around the 1700s by the King of Spain. I found a cédula real, like a royal law, royal letter, in which he says that the Dutch Empire was negotiating illegally with the enslaved, that they were supposed to pay taxes to the Spanish colonies, but they were not doing so. So he ordered the installment of the Vigía del Fuerte just across from Bellavista, so that they could keep an eye on we say in Spanish, merchants. I think it's merchants, yes, the merchants that were bringing in enslaved people and were not paying the taxes to the colony. So Bellavista, like finding the evidence, the town is still called like that, Vigía del Fuerte, and finding the evidence of these historical moments makes Bellavista a really important case in the connections to the other massacres, because we can find evidence that the same piece of land has been contested for several centuries. So it makes the case of the massacre not an insulated event, but it makes a case that is connected to other events of violence and political disputes in the country. Thank you. No, and thank you also for your research, because your books on ethnography and bound ethnography and your perspectives of ethnography were really important for me to develop this framework. So thank you for everything.
Marwa?
Thank you so much for this brilliant and incredibly important research and presentation. I see so many connections with my work on necropolitics in Egypt and also in Northeast African populations in the United States. I really appreciate the way you emphasize, deracination as a way to push against categories and approaches to displacement that help us to get beyond, the idea of post-trauma and resettlement as a solution for these kinds of, deeply rooted inequalities and violence that unfolds. I also push against the use of terms like migrant, refugee, because it gets people stuck in the spectacular moment of violence, and they miss the longitudinal, what you talked about, the historical depth. And that's where I see the critical race theory coming into your work and into this conversation about displaced African diasporic populations. Laboratories of death and geographies of death is just so revolutionary, because, we've inherited a post-colonial geographical orientation of the world. And I always wonder how we might rethink the world's connections, or the ways that people across the world are connected. How might we reimagine the map in a way that reflects pain or that reflects social suffering? And I think that geographies of death highlights the experiences of people who we just don't see in that geography, that post-colonial geography, and the way that we've been taught to imagine the world and its relationships. I also think about geographies of death and also of suffering. And that's something I've been really thinking about for quite some time, that when we can reimagine geography, we can connect the pain that people don't recognize in resettlement work and in displacement work. A lot of pain, the pain, like you mentioned, the embodied pain of feeling metal shrapnel moving through your body, the ongoing lived suffering that isn't captured by diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is typically what you see when people have undergone massacres, experienced or survived massacres. I've noticed with the Somali Bantu population that I worked with in Kansas City, this desire to categorize suffering, lived and ongoing unfolding suffering, as post-trauma. And that really creates a whole approach, it perpetuates an approach to healing that isn't really getting at the core issue. People are put into counseling, they're talked to about their post-trauma, and this moment in the past is considered something that just needs to be dealt with, and then people will be healthy and people will be happy. And that's really not what it takes. As you said, lives are completely altered for generations. You did such a phenomenal job of talking about the intergenerational pain that people do not consider, that shapes subjectivities and intersubjectivities, that shapes the direction people's lives continue to take. And so I really thank you for that, as a person whose family is also displaced in this sort of African, diasporic geography, who, I've witnessed pain and suffering that resettlement workers or people working with these communities just don't see, because I have sort of also been a part of that intergenerational story of unrecognized pain. I think you talked about what's at stake in forgiveness. And what I really find moving about that is the way you bring forgiveness into the story of necropolitics. And that these efforts by the state to approach communities are not really about genuine forgiveness. And what your presentation shows and what your research shows is that local populations are very aware of that, and very aware of the way that forgiveness or discourses about forgiveness and reconciliation operate in perpetuating necropolitics forward. So, and how rejecting that is actually a part of necropolitics. Rejecting it, rejecting the Black Jesus, all of these are also a part of the story of necropolitics, because it isn't just necropower from the state down. Necropolitics are also being enacted and engaged with at the grassroots level. So I really appreciate that. And the one thing I wanna end with is a question for you, because you are a critical researcher and you're working on a topic and in a context in which necropolitics continue. And you talked about fear. You talked about that sense of fear, that sort of reflexive experience in the field as you're doing field work, the recognition of how serious, maybe how dangerous people's everyday lives are. So I wonder, in Egypt, writing about anything related to social science is a risk these days, especially after 2013. Social scientists from the United States, Europe, and Egypt have been arrested, put into detention, prison, sentenced to life, and all of these different repercussions. The work they do is also sometimes used to crack down further on communities. I'm someone they call a heritage researcher because I work in my own community or my own heritage community. So I think a lot about harm and risk and danger. And I think about it a lot differently than when I was trained to think about it in graduate school. So as we're tied up in our research sites, I wonder how you deal with those questions of harm and risk. I wonder if it influences what you decide to highlight and write about. I wonder if it influences decisions you make about what to include, about how to keep your community safe, your family safe, and yourself safe, right? Because what you're doing is an important part of this necropolitical engagement. So I wonder if you might just offer a few comments about that. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for your answer, and thank you for your reflections and for finding connections to your own research. I'm also looking forward to listening to your research because I think we have strong connections as well. I'm really moved by your answer. So I don't know if I can keep myself together to articulate my answer. If I don't, we definitely can continue discussing about this because I have been thinking about this a lot. In my book, actually, it took me a while to publish one short version of the book until I was able to write in the first few pages that was the most difficult stories that I have been able to write or that I have been faced to write, because I was able to know so many details of the stories that I'm still working through, because there are cases that are so emblematic. Just to show you an example, one of the women that survived the massacre, She stayed in this charge for 4 days. She was not able to move. That's the reason why we know that Menelia helped them, that Menelia fed them, and all the things that happened there. This woman survived the massacre, that even though she was a survivor of the massacre, her community was constantly challenging her, because some of the survivors say that they saw her son in the side of the guerrilla group. His son was forcibly recruited by the guerrilla members years before the massacre. So some members of the community questioned her raising of the kid and blame her for the kid being recruited by the guerrilla members. And while she is trying to navigate being the survivor of a massacre, being blamed by her son being recruited by the guerrilla members, she had to endure a lot of pain, because she had to ask the government to end the war so that her son could return home. And then at the same time, try to heal from that. So imagine the pain this woman is facing. After the peace agreement, her son returned home, and her son was killed by other armed groups. And when she was going to bury her son, you could see like 3 different circles. The family trying to bury this person, the circle of the former guerrilla members, and the circle of the community that wanted to accompany, but did not want it to be too close. That happened, and I have not been able to publish the story because I've been working with her and other members of the community about how to write about this and how to publish about this and why to publish it. Details such as this that are so complicated are part of the many stories that I found during the ethnographic process. And I did not want to publish the book, and it took me a while to publish it because I was convinced about the lit review. I was convinced about the holes in the literature of forced displacement and forced migration, and I wanted to publish that. But the stories about the survivors of the massacre, I did not want them to be only the stories of the survivors of the massacre, but also the stories of the politics of spirituality, the politics of resistance. But I also wanted the members of the community to be involved in the process of the book and to answer to it. So it was not until I returned to the community and took the time to read with them in English and in Spanish, and then find spaces to heal together. Because I think that while we're doing this research, enduring so much pain can be a very traumatic experience. And reading with them, they will say, I will translate for them. I will bring the manuscript to the community and tell them, this is what's going to be published. So I want you to listen to it and let me know what you think, and let's discuss. Because they are really critical of what we do. And I really appreciate that. So I was reading in Spanish and they will say, no, read it in English. I want to hear how my words are going to sound in English. And then it took a long time to do that process, that back and forth. And then some details, they say that could place them in danger, but they were okay with that. They said, we have been suffering so much that just publish it. We'll see what happens. And then they say, after the publication of the book, nothing important will happen if we cannot continue working with the government, if we do not work in this community. So that's the reason why we created this participatory action research process. And then when I finished that, I wrote one paragraph saying that I was able to be at peace with the idea of publishing the book because I talked to the women, we revised the book with them. And then I realized that to complete the book, I needed to develop this chameleonic ethnographic persona, because I needed to be really careful where I conducted the interviews. I needed to be really careful that these women were not placed in a position in which they were going to be killed, or that I did not wrote the stories with revealing details that were going to place them in great danger. So thinking about the chameleonic ethnographic persona in context of violence helped me to reflect on how to do this research that needs to be done, but takes a lot to be done, because most of us don't want to be at risk. We don't want to be in these positions, in these contexts that are so violent and so contested. But I have this feeling that if we do not take the risk to do the research, at some point we are complacent with what's happening. At some point, I think that if we don't write, if we live in these territories in which this is happening, and we don't write about that, and we don't make sure that their stories are known, we are just like at peace with the idea that so much violence is happening somewhere, but it's not happening to us. So that's the reason why I decided to create this concept of the chameleonic ethnographic researcher, to say that sometimes I had to go to the community as a professor that was going to help the kids to learn something. And then learning with the students, we were able to come up with this idea, or how to write a new story, or how to learn a new song. Sometimes I also travel as a member of the church. One time I traveled as a missionary, so that the guerrilla members and the paramilitary members were not asking all these crazy questions, and they would just leave me alone. And I decided, when I was working for the church, let's say for the Holy Week or for Christmas, I was just helping with the decoration, helping with everything that they needed. And then we found space to interview the women and then just decide what to do with their stories. So I have been thinking a lot about harm and risk. The way in which I have navigated this so far is to select the sites carefully so that nobody is placed in danger. Also to select what's going to be published, so that it is important for sociological research, it is important for the story of the community, and at the same time, it's important for the legal processes that they are leading, so to get their reparation. So I definitely think we need to continue talking about this, because I have really strong reflections and notes and ideas and experiences about what happened in the field work that we can together reflect on how to connect it to your research and also to the new projects that I'm conducting in the field.
Thank you. Thank you, Aurora. We're going to end here. I have no words that can do justice to your eloquence or the importance of your work, except to say thank you, and we wish you much luck as you move forward, and we look forward to the book that comes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you next week.